What's up guys, Jay here and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to continue our journey covering each of the primary weapons the classes have and go over their specialties and the list of overclocks that they have access to in their arsenal so you can have a better idea of the kinds of situations that they're useful in, as well as an idea of the kinds of setups you may want to use its overclocks with. Just so everybody knows, yes, I am planning on doing the secondary weapons eventually once I get done with the primaries, so make sure to stay tuned for those videos at some point in the future. Today we are going back to our favorite rock smoothie enthusiast, the driller, and going over his handheld air conditioner, the Cryo Cannon. So if you guys are ready, let's talk about the Cryo Cannon and the kinds of tricks it has access to, so you can see if it's the primary weapon to add to your build. By the way, if you like this video and want to see more, make sure you subscribe so you never miss another upload.
Fueled up and raring to go.
So as usual, in order to understand what the Cryo Cannon's overclocks do, you first need to understand what the weapon does at a base level. The refrigerator gun is the second primary weapon the driller has access to, meaning it won't take you too long to get your hands on it to be able to use it to freeze enemies solid. It spits out a freezing cold stream of icy, which deals damage and decreases the temperature of enemies. Hit the enemy with enough cold and eventually they will freeze solid. Frozen enemies will receive triple damage, are completely immobilized, but lose access to any weak points that they had before. Note that the damage increase is only 2.5 times against dreadnoughts. Being frozen also prevents several enemies from performing their unique abilities. For example, the glyphid exploders and bulk detonators cannot explode, which could actually be seen as a bad thing if you get a golden detonator. Also, flying enemies like Mactera will drop and shatter instantly when frozen. So the Cryo Cannon definitely functions much more differently than the flamethrower we talked about before. First and foremost, the Cryo Cannon does not utilize a reloading system and instead draws from one pool of reserve ammo referred to as pressure, indicated by a curved fuel meter which depletes with use. Pressing the fire button causes the weapon to have a brief charge-up period as it spins up before it spews its stream of slushy. Constant firing will eventually empty the pressure meter and require a repressurization phase before it can start firing again. After firing the weapon, the turbine will remain partly spun up, indicated by a secondary gauge, and will only require the full spin-up period after a few seconds without firing. This is all a very fancy way of saying that the gun essentially functions similar to weapons that have an overheat system such as the gunner's minigun and the scout's plasma carbine. Basically, just keep an eye on the pressure gauge and don't let it get too out of hand as to not risk delaying your next damage cycle. A few minor things to note with the Cryo Cannon. First, similar to the flamethrower, the Cryo Cannon will leave behind a trail of ice that lingers for a few seconds. It won't do any damage, but it can potentially freeze enemies. It's just something useful to keep in mind as you are using this particular weapon. One last note is that enemies in the glacial strata biome are more resistant to this weapon's freezing effect. I guess it does make sense since those enemies are in very frigid environments.
Heavy duty excavation ain't no funny thing.
So now getting into the real nitty-gritty of the weapon with the overclocks in question. Currently as of Season 4, the Cryo Cannon has 6 overclocks at its disposal. 1 clean, 3 balanced, and 2 unstable. Now the Cryo Cannon has some really interesting overclocks, so let's dive into them and see what they do and how they can be used in your build. On that note, we're going to start with the clean overclocks, and this is the first weapon so far that only has one option with improved thermal efficiency. The description says, get all you can from your fuel and lose pressure slower from the main chamber. So as clean overclocks go, this one is pretty standard as it gives you an increase in tank capacity and an improved pressure drop rate, which is essentially the same thing as a magazine size for most other weapons. To be specific, it gives you plus 25 to your overall tank capacity and improves the pressure drop rate by 25%. So as I've said several times in this series so far, you can never go wrong with simply giving yourself more ammo to work with, which is essentially what this overclock does for you. It gives you more icy to give to the bugs and allows you to fire it longer, which may be simple and straightforward, but is also universal and allows for many different builds to be made with it. Moving on immediately to the balanced overclocks, the first one is Tuned Cooler. This one reads, freeze things faster at the cost of a slower pump and turbine. So this overclock gives you the ability to increase your damage significantly at the cost of worse pressure management. Going through the numbers, it gives you +1 to your freezing power and increases the flow rate by 10%. To compensate, the charge up time is increased by 0.2 seconds and the pressure gain rate is increased by 50%. This overclock can actually be very useful, especially if you build your Cryo Cannon the right way. The worst thing about this overclock is the hit you take to your pressure management. However, you can take certain mod choices like improved pump in tier 3 or faster turbine speed in tier 1 to help offset these drawbacks to some extent. This is normally the overclock that I default to when using the Cryo Cannon, because it is relatively easy to use without thinking too much. It doesn't have any special or fancy mechanics that you need to keep in mind like some of the other ones that we're going to go over. It's just a good boost to damage, and the only real thing you need to manage and keep in mind is that you have to be a little bit more aware of how long you are firing the weapon for, since you don't have as much control over when it runs out. If you can get used to that, then this will be an effective weapon overclock that is capable of doing some very strong damage. The next balanced overclock we have is the flow rate expansion. The description says a low volume, high pressure chamber paired with a high power pump increases the flow rate and repressurization speed, but lowers the max duration of sustained flow. This describes it pretty well, with essentially more rate of fire and a faster reload, countered by essentially a smaller magazine. Going over the numbers, it increases the pressure gain rate by 170% and the flow rate by 10%. This is offset by a change in the pressure drop rate by 125%. So this overclock is for when you want to hold down the trigger and not stop shooting until you run out of stuff to shoot with. This overclock allows you to get a lot of ice thrown at the bugs, which can be very useful if you are leading into the act of freezing swarms and tough enemies. You can apply the freeze debuff very fast with this overclock, especially when paired with mods like Stronger Cooling Unit in Tier 1 and Super Cooling Mixture in Tier 4. This is good if you are dealing with a lot of big tough enemies and want to stop and soften them up for your team. It can also be good at stopping swarms almost instantly with how fast you apply the freeze to enemies. Whichever way you use this overclock, it can help you spit out ice faster than even Mr. Freeze himself.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
The last balanced overclock option we have is Ice Spear. This one says, pressing the reload button dumps all the fluid in the chamber directly into the turbine, flash freezing it and launching an ice projectile. Side effects include an increased recharge delay and of course the large amount of fuel used. So this one changes how the Cryo Cannon functions on a base level by giving you an entirely new way to use it. To go over the basic changes, it gives you access to the Ice Spear ability, but counters with increasing the repressurization delay by 1 second. So going over what exactly the Ice Spear lets you do, it lets you press the reload button to load 50 of the weapon's fuel into a single chunk of ice that you can shoot out that does both direct impact damage and a good amount of AoE damage, as well as applying a stun to the enemy hit. The projectile has a good amount of range and it allows you to do some strong burst DPS instead of the steady stream of ice that we're used to. So a few things to note about this overclock. First, you cannot use it if you don't have enough fuel in the tank for a full charge. Second, the damage of the Ice Spear itself is at a fixed number and has no way of being scaled. Those two things said, the Ice Spear is capable of giving you some very strong range damage in high amounts. Also, since it does not scale in any way, you can focus solely on ammo increasing mods like larger reserve tanks in both tiers 1 and 4, and you won't be losing much in the process. If you like the Cryo Cannon but wanted it to have a little bit more fancy capabilities, then this overclock might be the choice for you. Now we're moving over to the big bad unstable overclocks, and the first one we have is Ice Storm. This one reads, a change in the fuel mixture along with some heavy cooler unit tweaks means a lot more damage, especially to frozen targets. However, freezing takes longer and the capacity of the pressure chamber is reduced. So this one almost feels like the inverse to the flamethrower's face melter overclock, but instead of a lot more flames, you are instead hitting with a lot more ice. To go over all the numbers, the weapon does straight up 2 times more damage, plus an additional 100% more damage done to frozen targets. However, to offset this insane damage increase, your freezing power is reduced by 3, your tank capacity is reduced by 75, and your pressure drop rate is increased by 50%. So this overclock is insanely strong across the board with the exception of the significant hit to your freezing power. In my experience, the other drawbacks are easy to deal with for the most part, but the insane boost in damage it gives you, only to make it really hard to get the max amount of damage, is what makes this overclock unstable. In order to get the most out of this overclock, you need to have your Cryo Cannon set up to handle it. The exact setup is going to vary depending on what you can handle, but I would say personally that I almost always take both of the freezing power increase mods with this and then prioritize pressure and ammo as best I can. This is a tricky one to use but can absolutely decimate difficult enemies. Tough bugs like the oppressor and detonators can be made short work with this overclock. If you want to send everything to absolute zero and shatter everything around you, then this is the one for you. The last unstable overclock option is Snowball. The description says, pressing the reload button shoots all the cryo fuel in the chamber at once as an AoE cryo projectile. Besides the very large amount of fuel consumed, the operation overloads the whole system, resulting in a much longer delay before regaining pressure, and the modifications restrict the total amount of fuel you can carry. So this is like if you took the Ice Spear overclock we talked about earlier and dialed it up to 11. First, to go over the basic changes, it gives you access to the Snowball ability while decreasing tank capacity by 100 and increasing repressurization delay by 1 second. So let's talk about the Snowball ability. Well, as I just said, it essentially is a bigger but also a slightly different alteration of the Ice Spear ability. Snowball itself shoots a ranged AoE projectile that consumes 25 fuel and instantly freezes everything in the impact zone. Additionally, every hit enemy creature receives cold damage over time. So while the Ice Spear is just that, a spear, this thing is more like a ice grenade that covers a much wider area and can insta-freeze enemies at will. It is a very strong choice if you want a heavy area control and the ability to freeze troublesome bugs very quickly and easily. It can be a little intimidating to use at first, and I wouldn't rely on it too much or else you will find yourself running out of ammo more times than not. Still, if you can harness the amount of raw cold that this thing can dish out, you will see just how much you can give the bugs the cold shoulder.
I'm having the best time in my life right now.
So with all these overclocks a bit more explained, hopefully you have a better idea of how to use the Cryo Cannon to great effect. While the Cryo Cannon isn't necessarily my go-to weapon with the driller, I cannot deny that it is a very effective and insanely fun weapon to use. Whether you want to blast spears or balls of cold energy at a distance, or just go wild with things like Ice Storm or Tuned Cooler, the Cryo Cannon has many ways to show that it is the best driller primary. Well, there you have a rundown of the Cryo Cannon and the overclocks it has access to you and how you might be able to fit them into your build. Now you can decide if you want to use the Cryo Cannon as the primary weapon for you. If you guys like this and want to see more videos covering the weapon overclocks, let me know down below. And if you have any other ideas that you want to see on the channel, let me know those as well. I love hearing your guys' ideas. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful. Please give it a like because it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time for another video.